There were 43 people in that restaurant the night Victoria Ashford started dying. 43 people with money, power, connections, and security clearances. 43 people who could have moved, who could have acted, who could have crossed the 12 feet of polished marble floor between themselves and the woman choking to death at table 7. Not one of them did. The man who moved wore a suit he'd bought at a thrift store for $60. He had calluses on both hands, a scar along his jaw he never talked about, and a 9-year-old daughter sitting across from him who had been waiting 3 months for this birthday dinner. He didn't think about any of that when he stood up. He just moved. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the moments that actually matter, then hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And don't forget to like this video, because every single one of those helps me keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let's go back to that restaurant. Let's go back to the night that changed everything. The reservation had taken Ethan Walker 4 phone calls, 2 weeks on a waiting list, and a level of patience he hadn't needed since he was sitting in a surveillance hide in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, waiting for a target who showed up 6 hours late. Le Bernardin wasn't the restaurant. That one was too famous, too photographed, too likely to show up in a magazine. The place Ethan had booked was called Ashton's, a steakhouse on the 53rd floor of a glass tower on West 57th Street that charged $40 for a side of mashed potatoes and required a jacket for men. He'd read the dress code 3 times to make sure he understood it. He owned one jacket. He'd had it dry cleaned the week before, which cost more than he wanted to think about. Sophie had worn her blue dress, the one with the white collar that she'd picked out herself last spring and worn exactly twice. Once to her school's winter concert, and now tonight. She'd done her own hair, which meant there was a barrette slightly crooked above her left ear, and she had refused to let him fix it on the grounds that she'd done it herself, and it was fine. It was not fine, but he'd let it go. She was 9 years old today. 9. He kept catching himself doing the math in a way that didn't quite make sense emotionally. 9 years since the hospital, since Ellen, since the specific kind of silence that follows, a moment when everything in your life shifts direction permanently, and without your consent. 9 years of figuring out how to be 2 parents at once. 9 years of getting it wrong in small ways, and he hoped, right in the ways that counted. The taxi ride uptown had cost $31. Sophie had spent it with her face pressed to the window, watching the city blur past, narrating everything she saw in a low-running commentary that was mostly for herself. A dog in a sweater, a man on a unicycle, a woman in a fur coat having a very loud argument on her phone. She seems upset, Sophie had said seriously. Yeah, Ethan agreed. About money, I think. You could hear that from in here? No, Sophie said, but it's usually money. He'd looked at her for a moment and thought, I have absolutely no idea where you came from. Again, they were seated at a table near the east-facing window, which gave them a view of Midtown that Sophie immediately declared was the best thing I've ever seen in my life, including the time we saw that hawk eat a pigeon in the park. Ethan had ordered her a Shirley Temple and himself a sparkling water, and they'd spent 10 minutes reading through a menu that didn't have prices on the items, which he understood was a power move on the restaurant's part, and which he found quietly irritating. The room was the kind of room designed to make certain people feel at home, and other people feel like they'd wandered in through the wrong door. Dark wood paneling, chandeliers with the right amount of dimness, tables spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private, waitstaff who moved like they'd been choreographed. Ethan was aware, in the specific way that people with his background were always aware of their environment, that he did not look like he belonged here. His jacket fit him correctly. He wasn't that bad off. But there was something about the way he held himself that was different from the men at neighboring tables. Less performance. More attention. He watched exits without meaning to, clocked the positions of the other diners and the staff with the kind of automatic inventory that you didn't stop doing just because you'd been out of the service for 7 years. Old habit. It had no practical application in a Manhattan steakhouse. He knew that, but the knowledge didn't stop the habit. Okay, Sophie said, putting her menu down with the gravity of someone making a decision of real consequence. I'm getting the pasta. This is a steakhouse. I know, they have pasta. It's on page 3. We could get the ribeye and split it. I don't want to split anything. It's my birthday. He looked at the pasta. It was $36. He looked at his daughter's expression, which was the expression she had learned, he suspected, from watching him. The one that said, I've made my decision and the discussion portion of this evening is finished. Okay, he said. Pasta. She smiled at him across the table, and it was such a specific smile. Not the big performance one she did for photos, but the real one, small and slightly lopsided, the one that looked like Ellen's smile in a way that still occasionally caught him completely off guard, that he had to look down at his menu for a second and breathe. Dad. Yeah. Thank you for this. She said it the way kids say things when they've been thinking about it ahead of time. Deliberate, meaning it. You only turn 9 once, he said. You say that every year. It's true every year. The party at table 7 arrived at 7:40. Ethan noticed them the way he noticed everything, peripherally, without staring, cataloging without thinking about the act of cataloging. 6 people. Private dining section, but the glass partition had been folded back so the room was open. 2 men in dark suits with the particular physical stillness of professional security. 4 civilians. Business dinner, he assessed. The body language was professional, not social. Nobody touched each other. The conversation had the quality of a meeting with better food. The woman at the head of the table was the one who commanded the space. She didn't do it loudly, she wasn't the tallest or the most expensively dressed. But when she said something, the other 3 leaned in incrementally, adjusting their posture without noticing they were doing it. She was younger than he'd have expected for someone clearly running the show, early 30s maybe. Dark hair pulled back efficiently, the kind of composure that read either as confidence or exhaustion, and from this distance he couldn't tell which. He looked away. Sophie was describing her theory about why the Chrysler Building was better than the Empire State Building. He gave his full attention back to where it belonged. Sepras what? Their food arrived and it was good. Genuinely good, in a way that made Ethan reluctantly respect the $40 mashed potatoes, because they weren't pretending to be anything except exactly what they were, and they'd gotten there with some kind of technique he couldn't identify. Sophie's pasta got a 6 out of 10 rating, which she explained was because the sauce was good, but the portion size was disrespectful. Disrespectful, he repeated. I'm a growing person, she said. This is not a growing person portion. You want some of my steak? Yes, but don't make a thing of it. He cut a piece and moved it to her plate without comment. She ate it with the vindicated air of someone who had known all along this was the correct outcome. They talked about school. She was in 4th grade now, and apparently 4th grade had a lot of opinions about fractions that she did not share. They talked about her friend Maya, who had a hamster named Senator that Sophie deeply envied. They talked about whether it was better to be very good at one thing or pretty good at several things, and Sophie argued convincingly for the latter on the grounds that you need options. You need options, Ethan said. Always. That's just strategy. He looked at her. Where did you hear that? You, she said, without looking up from her pasta. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He heard the sound before he saw anything. It wasn't a dramatic sound. That was the thing nobody understood about emergencies until they were inside one. They didn't usually announce themselves with sirens or screaming. The sound was a cough that went wrong. A cough that cut off at an angle that didn't make physiological sense, followed by a chair scraping, followed by a very specific quality of silence from table 7 that was different from the ambient quiet of the restaurant. Ethan's head turned before he'd made a conscious decision to turn it. The woman, the one who'd been running the table, was standing. She'd pushed back from her chair and she was standing, and her hands were at her throat, and her face had gone from composed to the specific expression of someone who cannot get air in and has just fully understood what that means. The 2 security men were on their feet but not moving. One of them had his phone out. One of them was looking at the other one. The 3 other people at the table had all leaned back, all moved away from her involuntarily, the animal instinct to separate from something going wrong. Nobody was moving toward her. This took approximately 2 seconds to register. Ethan was on his feet in the third second. He heard Sophie say, "Dad?" behind him, and he said, "Stay there, Soph." And then he was crossing the 12 feet of marble floor at a pace that made the nearest waiter step sideways. And then he was at table 7, and he was behind the woman, and he was assessing. Her airway was compromised. She was still standing. Good. That was good. It meant she hadn't lost consciousness yet. It meant she was fighting. Her face had the grayish quality that precedes real oxygen deprivation. Her hands were still at her throat in the universal gesture that most people recognized even if they couldn't name it. "I've got you," he said. Not a question, not a request for permission, just information. He got his arms around her and positioned his hands correctly. He hadn't thought about this technique in years, but muscle memory was a more reliable system than conscious recall, and his hands went to the right place without consultation. And on the first compression, nothing happened. And on the second compression, something moved, and on the third compression, a piece of bread the size of a large marble came out of her airway and hit the tablecloth, and the woman made a sound like a door being pulled open on broken hinges, the specific, raw, desperate sound of someone getting their first breath back. He held on for another second, making sure. Then, carefully, he steadied her and stepped back. The room had gone completely, absolutely still. She was leaning against her chair, both hands on the table, breathing in the focused, concentrated way of someone reacquainting themselves with an activity they'd almost lost permanently. Her face was coming back, color returning, the gray retreating. Her eyes were open. They found Ethan. "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She didn't answer immediately, which he understood. She was still working on the breathing, and the breathing was more important than the answering. "Okay," she finally said. Her voice was raw and low. "You should sit down." She sat down. One of the security men, the larger one, the one who hadn't had his phone out, stepped forward now, 3 seconds too late, with the energy of someone attempting to reclaim professional relevance. "Ma'am, are you—" "I'm fine, Davis." Flat. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at Ethan. One of the men in suits at the table, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had probably been called handsome often enough that he'd started believing it formed part of his personality, had risen from his chair. He was looking at Ethan the way Ethan had seen people look at problems they needed to reclassify. "Who the hell are you?" the man said. Ethan looked at him. "Nobody," he said. "You just grabbed our CEO." "Your CEO was choking," Ethan said. The flatness of his own voice surprised him slightly. Somebody had to. The implication sat in the air between them. The man in the suit heard it, his jaw tightened. "Security," he said, sharpening the word. "I want this man's identification." "Nathaniel," the woman's voice, still rough but steady. "Stop." The man, Nathaniel, stopped. She looked at him for a moment, and the look contained something complicated and tired. Then she looked back at Ethan. "You did that correctly," she said. It wasn't quite a thank you. It was more like an observation from someone who'd made a habit of assessing competence. "Modified Heimlich," he said. "You had a complete obstruction. A few more seconds and you'd have lost consciousness." "I'm aware," she said quietly. "You should have someone look at you tonight. Throat trauma can develop over a couple of hours." "I'll do that." She paused. "What's your name?" "Ethan Walker." She nodded slowly, cataloging it. "I'm Victoria Ashford." "I know," he said. He didn't, actually. He hadn't recognized her. He said it because it seemed like the right thing to say, and then he realized that wasn't particularly honest, and he didn't have a good way to course correct, so he let it stand. "Mr. Walker." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something specific in her expression that he didn't quite have a word for. Calculation wasn't right. Assessment was closer. "Thank you." "Sure," he said. He looked once more at Nathaniel, who was watching him with an expression that had quieted into something more careful and more dangerous than the anger that had been there before. The anger had been reflexive. What replaced it was deliberate. Ethan had seen that look before, not in boardrooms, in other places. He filed it away. Then he turned and walked back across the 12 feet of marble floor and sat down across from his daughter. Sophie was watching him with the specific expression she got when she was absorbing something and hadn't yet formed a final opinion about it. "You okay?" he asked. "I should be asking you that," she said. "I'm fine. That lady almost died." "Yeah. And none of those other people did anything." It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer it as one. He picked up his fork. "Is she okay now?" Sophie asked. "She's okay now." Sophie looked over toward table 7 for a moment, then back at him. She picked up her own fork. "Good," she said. They finished dinner. Sophie got a slice of chocolate cake that she declared deserved a 9 out of 10, with points deducted for insufficient frosting thickness. Ethan drank his sparkling water and paid the bill, which was more than he'd told himself it would be, but less than he'd quietly feared. He left a tip that was larger than was strictly practical because the waiter had handled the whole situation without making it theatrical. In the elevator going down, Sophie leaned against his arm. "Dad?" "Yeah. You know how you always say the job is just what you do, but the reason is who you do it for?" He didn't remember saying exactly that, but it sounded like something he might have said in a version of himself that was trying to explain things clearly. "Yeah," he said. "I think that lady's going to want to know who you are," Sophie said. "Like, really know." The elevator reached the lobby. "Let's get a cab," he said. Sophie straightened up and walked out beside him into the cool Manhattan night, her crooked barrette catching the light from the street, her blue dress moving around her ankles. He didn't look back at the building. But she wasn't wrong. The cab ride home took 22 minutes. Sophie fell asleep somewhere around the FDR Drive, her head tipped against the window, breath fogging the glass in small, even clouds. Ethan watched the city slide past on the other side of her reflection and didn't think about table 7, or told himself he wasn't thinking about it, which was a different thing. He paid the driver, carried Sophie up 2 flights of stairs. She was getting too old for this, she would have told him so if she'd been awake, and put her to bed still in her blue dress because undressing her would wake her up, and she'd had a long night, and she deserved to sleep through the rest of it. He unpinned the crooked barrette and set it on her nightstand, pulled the blanket up, stood in the doorway for a moment the way he always did, for reasons he couldn't have articulated precisely, some combination of checking that she was real, and checking that she was safe, and checking that the apartment was quiet in the right way. Then he went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water standing at the sink and looked at the stack of bills on the counter that he'd pushed to one side before they'd left that evening, so Sophie wouldn't see them during the getting ready process. The cable company, the landlord, a medical bill from 6 months ago that was apparently not finished with him, a notice from the bank about the checking account that he'd read twice and understood and still couldn't do anything about. He put the glass in the sink and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. Toots. Nathaniel Cross had a corner office on the 41st floor of Ashford Technologies' Manhattan headquarters, and he'd had it for 6 years. And in that time, he had developed an extremely refined understanding of which problems needed to be solved quickly and which ones needed to be solved carefully, and which ones, most importantly, needed to be made to look like they'd never existed at all. He stood at his window at 10:15 that night. He'd come back to the office after the dinner, which he often did when something was bothering him, because the office was the one place where everything was arranged in a way that made him feel correctly proportioned to his environment, and thought about Ethan Walker. Nobody. That's what the man had said. Nobody. Nathaniel had been building his case against Victoria for 4 months. It was meticulous work, the kind of work that required patience and precision and the willingness to move slowly when every instinct said to move fast. He had the medical consultant lined up. He had 2 board members who owed him enough to ask the right questions at the right moments. He had documentation, or what would look like documentation once it went through the right channels. What he did not have, and had not anticipated needing to account for, was a stranger from outside the operation who had inserted himself into the most visible moment of the plan's first phase and come out of it looking like the only competent human being in the room. The security team's delay had been arranged. Not obviously. Nathaniel wasn't an amateur, but arranged. Davis and the other one, Garrett, had been told there were updated emergency protocols, told that independent action created liability, told to assess and report before acting. It was the kind of instruction that sounded administrative until it wasn't. The delay was supposed to look like hesitation, like institutional caution, like the kind of thing that happened when security teams were poorly trained. It was not supposed to be interrupted by a man in a $60 suit who moved like he'd spent years in situations where not moving meant someone died. Nathaniel turned from the window and sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He typed, Ethan Walker, New York, Act. Ethan's phone rang at 7:43 the next morning while he was making Sophie's lunch. He almost didn't answer it. The number was unknown, and unknown numbers at 7:43 in the morning were almost never good news. But something made him pick up. Mr. Walker, a woman's voice. Controlled, professional, the voice of someone who made calls like this regularly and had learned to front-load efficiency. My name is Karen Lyle. I'm executive assistant to Victoria Ashford. Ms. Ashford would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. He put the knife down on the cutting board. How'd she get my number? A brief pause. Ms. Ashford has resources available to her. Yeah, he said. I'm sure she does. He looked at the half-made sandwich on the counter. Turkey, sharp cheddar, mustard, no tomato because Sophie considered raw tomato a personal insult. She okay? From last night? She's been seen by a physician and is recovering well. Thank you for asking. The professionalism in Karen Lyle's voice softened by approximately 3%. She'd very much like to thank you in person, Mr. Walker. Are you available this morning? I have a job. We could arrange. I have a job, he said again, not unkindly. I'm not available in the morning. I can do a lunch break, 12:30, 45 minutes. Another pause. Longer. He got the sense that not many people gave Victoria Ashford a 45-minute window with a hard stop. 12:30, Karen Lyle said. I'll text you the address. He hung up and finished the sandwich. Sophie noticed the phone call the way she noticed most things, quietly, from the side, while appearing to be occupied with something else. She was eating her cereal and looking at the table. Was that about last night? She asked. The lady, the CEO. He looked at her. How do you know she's a CEO? I looked her up, Sophie said simply. Victoria Ashford. She runs Ashford Technologies. They make software for hospitals and banks and stuff. She's worth like $4 billion. She ate a spoonful of cereal. That's a lot. It is, Ethan agreed. Are you going to go meet her? At lunch, yeah. Sophie nodded slowly, processing. You should probably look her up too, she said. So you know who you're talking to? I know who I'm talking to. You know her name and her job, Sophie said. That's not the same thing. He looked at his daughter for a moment, 9 years old and operating, apparently, at a level of strategic awareness that he hadn't fully appreciated until right this second. And then he said, Fair point, and went to get his own breakfast. Ekat. The address Karen Lyle texted him was not Ashford Technologies headquarters. It was a smaller building in Tribeca, a townhouse that had been converted to private office space, the kind of place where people conducted business they didn't want conducted in environments with security cameras and staff who remembered things. He was let in by a man who introduced himself only as Marcus, who had the specific build and stillness of someone with professional training, and who looked at Ethan with the careful neutrality of someone who had been specifically instructed to be polite. The room he was taken to was on the second floor. 2 chairs, a low table, good light from tall windows facing a garden. Victoria Ashford was already there. She looked different than she had last night, which wasn't surprising. Last night she'd been in crisis and then in shock recovery, and he hadn't been studying her face for reference. Now he had the chance to do what he always did when he met someone new in a context that mattered. Actually look at them. She looked tired. Not the surface tired of a bad night's sleep, but the deeper kind. The kind that had been accumulating over time and was now simply part of the baseline. She'd covered it competently. She was put together, present, professional. But it was there in the slight tension around her eyes, and the way she was holding herself a fraction more carefully than someone fully rested would need to. She was also, he registered as a secondary observation, clearly still assessing him the same way he was assessing her. "Mr. Walker," she said, and stood to shake his hand. Her grip was firm and quick, the handshake of someone who'd been taught that handshakes communicated things and had decided to communicate competence. Ms. Ashford," he said, "you look better than you did last night." It came out blunter than he'd intended. She blinked once, and then something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "That's a low bar," she said, "but I'll take it." She gestured to the chairs. "Please." They sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, which he didn't try to fill. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was a tool, and that the person who felt compelled to break it first was usually the person with more to explain. Victoria broke it. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Last night was—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You saved my life. I'm aware of what that means. I don't say it as a figure of speech." "I know," he said. "I've been in dangerous situations before," she continued. "Business carries risk. I've been threatened. I've had security concerns. I've dealt with people who wanted things from me in ways that weren't legal. But I've always had buffers, teams, systems." She paused. "Last night, in about 4 seconds, all of those systems were completely useless, and you—" She stopped again. "You weren't even there for me. You were there for your daughter's birthday." "Yeah." "How old is she?" 9. Yesterday." Victoria nodded. Something moved across her face, briefly, there and then gone. "I'd like to do something for you, Mr. Walker. For your family. It's not negotiable before you say it isn't necessary." "I was going to say it isn't necessary," he said. "I know." She held his gaze steadily. "I looked into you after last night." He felt the small, familiar tightening in his chest that came with that sentence. People who said "I looked into you" usually meant they'd found the broad strokes: military service, discharge, the years that came after, and were now deciding which version of him was more useful to them. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. His voice was level. "I found more than I expected," she said, and the way she said it made him think she meant it as a neutral statement of fact rather than a compliment, which he respected more. "Navy SEAL, 12 years, multiple deployments, 2 Silver Stars. You left in 2017. "Correct." "Your daughter was born that year." "No," he said. "She was born in 2015. I left in 2017 because—" He stopped. "It's not relevant." Victoria looked at him for a moment but didn't push it. "You've been working as an automotive mechanic, Hendricks and Sons, in Queens." "For 4 years, yeah." "You have significant debt." He held her gaze. "Is this the part where you offer me money and I'm supposed to feel like it solves something?" "No," she said. "This is the part where I tell you what I haven't told anyone else yet." She leaned forward slightly, and the tired executive composure shifted into something more direct, more stripped down. "Last night wasn't an accident. The word landed in the room differently than the others had." "The choking?" Ethan said. "The response to the choking." She watched his face carefully. "My security team has standing instructions. First action, assess. Secure the perimeter. Wait for confirmation from senior personnel before independent physical intervention." She said it like she was reading from a document, which he suspected she nearly was. She'd probably spent the night reviewing protocol logs. Those instructions were rewritten 6 weeks ago. By who? "They were passed through administrative channels with my authorization code," Victoria said, "which I did not authorize. Someone used my credentials." Ethan sat with that for a second. "You're saying someone changed the protocols so your team would stand down?" "I'm saying someone changed the protocols in a way that ensured that if I faced an emergency, there would be a delay in response." Her voice was quiet and very precise. "Long enough to look like incompetence. Long enough, potentially, to look like something worse." "If I hadn't been there—" "You'd have read about it this morning," she said flatly. "And it would have been reported as a medical incident, a tragedy, possibly an indication that the pressure of leading a company of this size was taking its toll on a young CEO who maybe wasn't equipped to handle it. The implication was clear enough that he didn't need her to make it explicit. Nathaniel Cross, he said. She looked at him sharply. What makes you say that? The way he looked at me, Ethan said. After. When you told him to stop. He thought about it for a second. The specific quality of the expression, the way the anger had cooled into something more calculated. He wasn't angry that I'd interfered. He was angry that I'd interfered successfully. Those are different things. Victoria was very still. I've seen that look, Ethan said. Not in offices, in other places. But the face is the same. He paused. He looked at me like I was a variable he needed to account for. Nathaniel Cross has been my COO for 3 years, Victoria said. He came with the highest possible recommendations. He's brilliant, he's effective, and for the first 18 months I would have told you he was the best hire I'd ever made. She stopped. Then I started noticing things. What kind of things? Small things. Decisions that routed around me. Board relationships that seemed warmer than they should have been. Members I didn't appoint, members who've been there since before my tenure. Conversations that stopped when I walked in. She shook her head slightly, not from uncertainty, but from what looked like a kind of exhausted frustration at herself. I should have moved on it 6 months ago. I didn't, because I couldn't prove anything, and moving against your COO without proof is how you hand someone a wrongful termination suit and a martyr narrative. So you waited. I was waiting, she said, and apparently he was moving faster than I was. Ethan looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked back at her. What do you want from me, Ms. Ashford? She met his gaze. I want to offer you a position. I have a position. I want to offer you a better one. She didn't say it with the smug ease of someone dangling money. She said it with the directness of someone who had something specific in mind. Head of Executive Protection and Medical Response Operations. You'd have authority over security protocol review, emergency response training, and my personal security arrangements. She paused. The salary would clear your current debt within 8 months. There are benefits. There's stability. I don't know anything about corporate security, he said. You know everything about protecting people under pressure, she said. The corporate part you can learn. The other part you either have or you don't. She held his gaze. You have it. Last night proved that beyond any reasonable argument. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she didn't try to fill the silence this time either. You're asking me to walk into a situation with an active threat from someone who already knows who I am, he said. Someone who's been planning this for months, probably longer, and who is currently recalibrating his approach because last night didn't go the way he needed it to. Yes, Victoria said, that's exactly what I'm asking. And you're doing this because I need someone around me whose loyalty I haven't had time to question, she said. Because everyone in that room last night who was paid to protect me stood still, and you moved without being paid at all. And that distinction matters to me. She stopped. And because if Nathaniel moves before I can prove what he's done, I lose the company, and a lot of people lose their jobs, and a man who decided to try to kill his boss rather than resign gets away with it. Ethan sat back. Outside the window, the garden was bare and neat. Late fall, nothing growing yet, just the clean lines of maintained beds waiting for the right season. I have a daughter, he said. Any threat to you potentially extends to people around you. I need that to be understood before anything else. I understand that. I'm not saying that for your benefit, he said. I'm saying it because if Sophie becomes a variable in this, I'm out. Full stop. No conversation. Understood, Victoria said, without hesitation. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them was performing. I need a day, he said. Of course. He stood. She stood. They shook hands again. The same firm, quick exchange as before, but different now, weighted differently. He was at the door when she said, Mr. Walker. He turned. What you did last night, she said. In the moment. You didn't think about it. No, he said. Most people would have, she said. Even good people. He thought about that for a second. About the 12 feet of marble floor, about the sound of the cough going wrong, about the specific fact that his body had moved before his brain had finished processing the input. Some things you stop deciding about, he said. After long enough, you just do them. He left her with that. The end. He was back at the shop by 1:15. Jimi Hendrix was under a Civic with a transmission problem that had been baffling both of them for a week, and he looked out from under the car when Ethan came through the bay door with the expression of someone hoping for backup. "You figure out that lunch thing?" Jimmy asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, pulling on his work gloves. "Go okay?" "Still deciding," Jimmy grunted. "Paying work?" "More than this." Another grunt, this one with more information in it. Jimmy had been running this shop for 22 years, and he understood the economics of the situation clearly enough not to pretend otherwise. He also understood Ethan well enough not to push. "Job's still here if it doesn't work out," he said, and rolled back under the car. Ethan looked at the Civic. He'd worked on this specific car for 4 years. He knew the sound of its engine at idle, knew the specific rattle it made when the heat came on, knew the way the brake pedal traveled about a quarter-inch further than it should. He knew this car the way you knew things when you spent enough time with them. Not because you studied them, but because proximity eventually became a kind of knowledge. He picked up a wrench. He thought about what Victoria had said. Some things you stop deciding about. After long enough, you just do them. He'd said that. But he'd been wrong about what it applied to. Because he spent the rest of the afternoon under that Civic deciding. Thinking about Nathaniel Cross's face. Thinking about Sophie's voice in the cab, steady and asleep. Thinking about a woman in a Tribeca townhouse who had looked at him without performing either gratitude or pity, just assessed him straight, person to person, and asked him plainly for something real. Thinking about debt and rent and the stack of bills on the counter and the specific weight of a life lived always one bad month from a different kind of emergency. Thinking about the thing he hadn't said to anyone in a long time, that part of him had been waiting in the vague, directionless way of someone who doesn't have a name for what they're waiting for, to feel like he was doing something again, something that required more of him than what he'd been giving. He didn't like that he was thinking it. It felt like a betrayal of the quieter version of himself he'd been trying to build since 2017. But quiet didn't mean the other thing had stopped being true. He finished the Civic at 4:40. The transmission problem turned out to be simpler than either of them had thought, which was occasionally how it worked. He called Karen Lyle on the drive to pick up Sophie from after school. "Tell Ms. Ashford I'll start Monday," he said. A pause. "I'll let her know, Mr. Walker. Can I ask—" "Monday," he said, and ended the call. Sophie was waiting on the school steps with her backpack between her feet and a book open on her knee, which was her standard end-of-day configuration. She looked up when his car pulled to the curb. She got in, buckled her seatbelt, looked at him. "You took the job," she said. He pulled into traffic. "How do you know?" "You have the look," she said, opening her book again. "What look?" "The one where you've decided something and it scared you a little, but you did it anyway." She turned a page. "It's a good look." He said nothing. "What's the job?" she asked. "Protecting someone?" "The CEO lady?" "Yeah." Sophie nodded, reading. "Is it dangerous?" He thought about Nathaniel Cross, about the changed security protocols, about the very specific way a man looked at you when he was reclassifying you from irrelevant to problem. "Probably," he said. Sophie turned another page. "Okay," she said. "Just tell me the truth about stuff. That's all I ask." He looked at his daughter in the passenger seat, 9 years old, blue dress replaced by school clothes, barrette back in her hair, and still slightly crooked, and felt the particular combination of things he almost always felt when he looked at her. Pride and fear and something that didn't have a clean name, some specific weight that came with knowing that every decision you made was also a decision you were making on behalf of someone who hadn't asked to be included in the risk. "I will," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and kept reading. He drove them home through the Tuesday afternoon traffic, and the city moved around them the way it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of things happening that nobody on the street could see. In a corner office 41 floors up, a man named Nathaniel Cross was looking at a file on his laptop. The file had a name on it. He'd been building something for a long time. He wasn't going to let one man in a $60 suit take it apart, but he didn't understand yet what kind of man he was dealing with. He would. Monday came the way Mondays always did. Too fast after a weekend that hadn't felt long enough, with a quality of gray morning light that made everything look slightly more daunting than it actually was. Ethan was up at 5:15, not because he needed to be. The car he'd borrowed from Jimmy to get Sophie to school and himself to Midtown didn't require that kind of lead time, but because he hadn't slept past 5:30 in 7 years and his body had simply stopped trying. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the street below do its early morning thing. The sanitation truck, the bodega owner pulling up the security gate, a woman walking a dog that looked deeply unenthusiastic about the temperature. He'd spent the weekend doing the things that needed doing. He talked to Jimmy, who had shaken his hand and told him not to be a stranger, and then immediately asked if he knew anyone looking for work, because Jimmy's needs were always practical and immediate. He'd arranged after-school coverage for Sophie through her friend Maya's mother, Carol, who was one of those people who offered things before you finished asking and meant every word of it. He'd bought 2 dress shirts at a department store sale rack, because the suit he owned was fine, but he wasn't walking into a tech company's executive floor every day in the same 3 pieces of fabric. Sophie had helped him pick the shirts. She'd vetoed the first one on the grounds that the blue was sad, and the second one on grounds she declined to specify, and eventually approved a gray one and a white one with the authority of someone who had strong opinions about professional presentation and did not apologize for them. "You look like a person who works in an office," she'd said, standing back to assess. "That's the goal." "I didn't say it was bad," she said. "Just different." Different was the right word. He thought about it on the drive to drop Sophie at school, her backpack on her lap, half awake, doing the thing she did every morning where she processed the day ahead in a private internal way that required no input from him. Different was the correct and honest description of what the next part of his life was going to look like, and he'd made his peace with that over the course of the weekend, or at least made a truce with it, which was probably more accurate. Sophie hopped out at the school entrance, pulled the strap of her backpack straight, then turned back. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Don't let them make you into something you're not," she said. Not dramatic about it. Just said it and then turned and walked into the building. He sat at the curb for a moment after she disappeared through the doors. Then he drove to Midtown. Ashford Technologies occupied floors 38 through 44 of a glass tower on 6th Avenue. The lobby was the kind of lobby that communicated things. High ceilings, the company's name in brushed steel on a dark wall, people moving through it with the particular purposefulness of people who knew exactly where they were going and had somewhere important to be. Security desk, badge readers, cameras at angles that suggested the system had been designed by someone who understood coverage gaps. Ethan clocked all of it in the 40 seconds it took to cross from the entrance to the desk. Karen Lyle met him in the lobby. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with efficient posture and the kind of face that had learned to be professionally neutral without becoming actually blank. There was still a person operating behind the composure, which he appreciated. She had a badge ready and a lanyard and a schedule printed on a single sheet of paper, which she handed him with the practiced efficiency of someone who managed things so that other people didn't have to. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. Miss Ashford is in a board call until 9:30. I'll take you up to your office and walk you through the access setup, and then she'd like to meet with you at 10. "My office," he said. 39th floor, corner, east side. She said it neutrally, as if it were simply information, without any of the implied significance a corner office might carry for someone coming from where he was coming from. "Karen," he said. "Yes?" "Just Ethan is fine." She considered this briefly. "All right, this way." The elevator required badge access above floor 36, which was the first sensible security decision he'd seen in the building. He noted the camera blind spot in the northeast corner of the elevator car and filed it away without deciding yet whether it was a design oversight or something worse. The office was larger than he'd expected and more bare. A desk, 2 chairs, a window with a view east toward Queens on a clear day, currently producing a view of gray sky and the middle sections of surrounding buildings. There was a laptop, a desk phone, a stack of folders he assumed were relevant. "The folders are background on current security personnel and protocols," Karen confirmed, which answered that. "There's also a summary of the administrative audit Ms. Ashford commissioned last week." "On the protocol changes?" "Yes." He pulled the top folder. Who knows I'm here? In this role. Karen paused in a way that suggested she'd anticipated this question and prepared for it. The official announcement is going out this morning. Head of Executive Protection and Medical Response Operations. New position, newly created. The language Ms. Ashford chose is, she glanced at something on her phone, reflective of our commitment to operational safety in an environment of evolving risk. HR signed off, legal approved. What does Nathaniel Cross know? The pause this time was different, shorter, but more careful. Mr. Cross received the same announcement everyone else did. He has not yet responded. Okay. Ethan set the folder down. Can you get me a list of every protocol change, administrative document, or access log modification that went through executive channels in the last 12 months, with timestamps and the credentials used to authorize each entry? Karen looked at him. That's quite a broad request. Yes, he agreed. I'll need to route it through IT security. It may require Ms. Ashford's direct authorization. Get that authorization and route it through IT security, he said. Please. And Karen, I'd like that information before anything else moves, if possible, before the 10 o'clock. She wrote something on the small notepad she was carrying. I'll do my best. I know you will, he said. Thank you. She left. He sat down, opened the first folder, and began reading. Mushin. Victoria arrived at his office at 9:57. She'd clearly come straight from the board call. There was still the slight tautness around her jaw that came from managing a conversation with a large group of competing agendas, the faint residue of performed patience. She was carrying a coffee cup and closed the door behind her, which he noted. How's the morning? She asked. Informative, he said. He had 3 folders open on the desk. Your security team has 11 people, 5 with prior law enforcement backgrounds, 2 former military, 4 from private sector firms. Of those, 3 transferred in during the last 8 months. Nathaniel approved those hires, she said. I know. He turned one of the folders to face her. This one, Marcus Reeves, came from Sentinel Group. I need to know if you or anyone in HR independently verified his references, or if the verification went through Cross's office. Victoria looked at the folder. I'd need to check. Add it to Karen's list. He leaned back in his chair. The protocol changes are more interesting. Whoever modified them used your credentials, like you said, but the modification was made at 11:14 on a Thursday night. I need to know where you were that Thursday. She looked up. You're checking my alibi. I'm establishing the timeline, Shinti, he said. If you were in the building after 11 on a Thursday, that's a different problem than if you were somewhere else. Because if you were somewhere else, the credential use was remote. And remote access to that system requires either your physical token or a bypass that shouldn't be possible without IT administrator involvement. Victoria set her coffee down. She sat in one of the 2 chairs across from his desk with the air of someone who was recalibrating something. That Thursday, she said slowly, October 9th, I was at a dinner, private, in Connecticut. I can verify that. I'll need you to. You'll need... She stopped. Something flickered across her face. You're serious? Yes. I'm your employer. Yes, he said again, evenly. And you hired me to protect you and to find out what's actually happening in your company. I can't do either of those things if I work around inconvenient information. So I need the Connecticut dinner documentation. Guest list, restaurant, ideally a charge to a company card or a personal card that shows a timestamp. He held her gaze. It's not about whether I trust you. It's about building something that can't be taken apart later. A long moment passed. Then Victoria said, You're different than I expected. How'd you expect me to be? I thought you'd be more, she gestured vaguely, deferential. Does that work for you? Deferential? No, she said. Not even a little. A beat. I'll get you the Connecticut documentation. Thank you. She picked up her coffee again. The board call this morning was, there was a motion raised, to review my fitness to serve in light of the incident last Thursday. He kept his expression neutral. Who raised it? Member named Gerald Fitch. He's been on the board for 9 years. Predates my tenure by 4. She turned the cup in her hands. He cited medical concerns following the publicized emergency. The motion didn't carry us. I still have enough of the board, but it was raised, formally. Is Fitch in contact with Cross? I have no proof. But, she looked at him directly, Gerald Fitch has had dinner with Nathaniel Cross 6 times in the past 3 months. I know this because Gerald's assistant and my assistant are friendly, and my assistant has good instincts and pays attention. Karen, Ethan said. Karen, Victoria confirmed. She's been with me since before I took over the company. She doesn't trust Cross. She never did, from day one. Smart woman. She is. Victoria paused. The motion failed, but Nathaniel will read the vote. He'll know how many board members he has and how many I have. And he'll know that I know. She set the cup down again with a small, deliberate click on the desk surface. Whatever he's planning next, he'll move it forward. How much time do you think we have? The next board meeting is in 3 weeks, she said. If he's going to make a formal move against my position, it happens then. He needs documentation, medical testimony, board votes. 3 weeks is enough time for all of that if he's been preparing it. He's been preparing it for months, Ethan said. Yes, she said quietly. He has. Ethan looked at the open folders for a moment, then, tell me about who he is, not the resume, the person. Victoria was quiet for a second, and he had the sense that she was deciding how honest to be. Not about the facts, which he thought she'd give him accurately, but about her own feelings about those facts, which was a different and more complicated territory. Nathaniel is the smartest person in most rooms he walks into, she said, and he knows it, and he's never fully learned what to do with that fact, except to make sure everyone else knows it too. She looked at the window. When I hired him, I thought his ambition was directional, that it pointed outward toward the company's growth. I didn't understand until much later that his ambition is actually self-referential. It points at himself. A pause. He doesn't want Ashford Technologies to succeed. He wants to be the person who runs something like Ashford Technologies. There's a difference, Ethan said. An enormous difference, she said. The company is a vehicle for him. It always has been. I just couldn't see it until the vehicle stopped being useful for the direction he'd decided to go. Did something change 3 months ago? Something that might have accelerated his timeline? Victoria looked back from the window. The question had landed somewhere. He could see it. 6 months ago, she said slowly, I finalized a restructuring plan. It would have changed COO authority significantly. Less independent budget discretion, more direct reporting to me. I hadn't announced it yet. It was still in development, but Nathaniel has sources in my legal team. She stopped. He probably knew before I'd even signed off on the draft. So he saw the restructuring coming and decided to move before it limited his options. That would be consistent, she said. Ethan closed the top folder. I need access to his communications. Anything on company servers, emails, calendar, internal message system. I need to know if that access is possible without alerting him. It's legally complex. Is it possible? He asked, separating the question from the complication. With the right authorization and the right IT support, yes. She met his gaze. But if we pull that trigger and there's nothing there, or if he finds out we looked, it hands him a weapon. I understand. He thought for a moment. What about physical access? His office? Does he keep physical documents? He's meticulous about print, she said. He prints things and stores them. I've always found it odd in someone who's otherwise entirely digital. A slight pause. I've wondered lately if it's deliberate. Harder to trace and harder to subpoena, Ethan said. Victoria looked at him for a moment. You're not doing this like I expected a security person to do it, she said. How'd you expect it? More cameras, more personnel, more visible deterrence. Visible deterrence works when the threat is external, he said. Your threat is internal. Visible deterrence just gives Nathaniel information about where your countermeasures are. She was quiet for a moment. I hired the right person, she said. It wasn't performed. She said it like she was checking an internal calculation and finding it correct. Ask me again in 3 weeks, he said. He met Nathaniel Cross at 11:45. Not by design, or not entirely. He'd been in the hallway outside the executive floor kitchen, running through a mental map of the floor's camera coverage, when the elevator opened and Cross came out with two men in suits who were having a conversation he was clearly driving and clearly had no intention of pausing. Then Nathaniel saw Ethan. The conversation stopped. Not obviously. It didn't drop off a cliff. But the energy shifted, the way a current shifted when something interrupted its path. Nathaniel Cross was built to present well. He was tall, broad-shouldered, without being physically imposing, gray-templed in the way that certain men carried as a kind of currency. His suit was excellent, and he wore it like he'd been born in it. His face, when he wanted it to, could produce warmth with sufficient accuracy to pass for the real thing. He was not producing warmth now. "Mr. Walker," he said. He said it with the tone of someone who had known this encounter was coming and had prepared remarks for it. "Mr. Cross," Ethan said. The two men with Nathaniel had stopped and arranged themselves in the unconscious flanking position of people who took their cues from their principal. Nathaniel himself walked toward Ethan with his hands loose at his sides and his expression set to something that communicated professional cordiality while communicating something else entirely underneath it. "I read the announcement this morning," Nathaniel said. "Welcome aboard. It's an unusual title." "It's an unusual situation," Ethan said. "Indeed." A pause that had weight in it. "You made quite an impression last week." "The situation called for it." "It did." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Though I have to say, it's a substantial jump, from automotive repair to executive protection at a technology company." The words were measured, each one placed with the precision of someone who understood that every sentence was also an argument. "Victoria can be impulsive in her gratitude. She means well." "Ms. Ashford," Ethan said, "seems pretty clear-eyed to me." A small adjustment happened in Nathaniel's expression, barely visible, but there. "Of course," he said. "I only mean that situations like last week can create a sense of obligation that feels more certain than it is. In calmer light, priorities clarify." He smiled. It was a good smile, technically. "If you ever want to talk through the reality of this environment, I'm happy to give you some context. It's a complicated company." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. He held Nathaniel's gaze steadily, the way he'd been trained to do in situations where breaking eye contact first communicated something you didn't want to communicate. "I'm sure I'll have questions." "My door is open." "Good to know." Nathaniel looked at him for one beat longer than was comfortable. The two suited men were watching without appearing to watch. Then Nathaniel nodded, a small, conclusive movement, and turned and continued down the hall, resuming the conversation as if it had never paused. Ethan watched him go. The encounter had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, Nathaniel Cross had communicated, without saying any of it explicitly, that he knew who Ethan was, that he considered Ethan's position illegitimate, that he expected Ethan to be manageable or temporary or both, and that he would be watching. Ethan had communicated, without saying any of it explicitly, that he was paying attention, that he was not intimidated, and that he had understood all of the above. It was, in its way, a complete conversation. He picked Sophie up from Carol's at 6:15. She was at the kitchen table doing homework, which she gathered with the efficient resentment of someone who found the concept of homework philosophically objectionable, but had decided to comply with the reality of it. In the car. "How was it?" "Fine," he said, which was his default, and she knew it. "Fine, like actually fine, or fine like there are things you're not going to tell me?" He glanced at her in the passenger seat. "Both, probably." "Okay." She looked out the window. "Did you meet the bad guy?" "What makes you think there's a bad guy?" "There's always a bad guy," Sophie said, with the serene certainty of someone who had consumed enough stories to understand structural patterns. "When the situation is that complicated, there's a person making it complicated." "I met him," Ethan said. "What's he like?" He thought about Nathaniel in the hallway, the quality of the smile, the precision of the words, the specific kind of intelligence that expressed itself as management managing the room, managing perception, managing the distance between what was true and what appeared true. Smart, Ethan said. Very practiced, comfortable with the performance of things. Meaning he lies a lot? Meaning he's gotten good at making the lie look like the thing, Ethan said, which is harder and more dangerous than just lying. Sophie absorbed this. Do you know what he's planning? Getting there. Does he know you're onto him? He knows I'm a variable he didn't plan for, Ethan said. Whether he understands yet what that means, probably not. Sophie nodded, returning to the window. Then, are you worried? He drove for a moment before answering, because she'd asked a real question, and the courtesy was to give it a real answer. Some, he said. The situation has moving parts I can't see yet. That part I don't love. But you've dealt with worse. Different kinds of worse, he said. This kind has lawyers and board votes instead of, He stopped. Instead of guns, Sophie finished, unbothered. Yeah. Is that better or worse? He thought about it genuinely. Honestly, not sure yet. She seemed satisfied with that, or at least satisfied that it was the true answer rather than a managed one. She went back to looking at the street. At 9:40 that night, after Sophie was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a legal pad beside it and began working through everything he'd read that day. The administrative audit Karen had forwarded him at 9:16 faster than he'd expected, which told him she'd been working on compiling it before he asked, was 63 pages. He read all of it. He made notes in his specific shorthand, the one he'd developed during years of writing intelligence assessments in conditions where brevity was necessary and accuracy was survival. 3 things emerged. The first was that the credential misuse on October 9th wasn't isolated. There were 2 earlier instances, smaller, less consequential, but the same pattern. A policy document modified, an access permission granted, both times after hours, both times using Victoria's authorization code. The second was that one of the 3 recently hired security personnel, Marcus Reeves, the one from Sentinel Group, had approved himself for access to the executive floor server room within 2 weeks of his hire. The approval had gone through a process that was technically compliant with Ashford Technologies' internal procedures, but had been signed off by Nathaniel Cross, rather than routed through IT governance as the protocol required. The third was something smaller, something that might have meant nothing, except that Ethan had spent enough years in environments where nothing meant nothing. One of the board members who'd voted in support of Gerald Fitch's fitness motion that morning, a woman named Patricia Weil, who had been on the board for 2 years and whom Ethan had no other information about, had a calendar entry blocked as external consultation every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 6 weeks. The entry was in Ashford's shared executive calendar system. It had no location, no attendees listed, no call information, just the 2-word label and a blocked time. He wrote PW, external consult recurring, verify, and circled it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing the thing he'd always done at the point in an operation where the picture was coming into focus, but the edges were still unclear. Held it lightly, let it breathe, didn't force a conclusion before the information was ready to produce one. He thought about what Victoria had said. Whatever he's planning next, he'll move it forward. 3 weeks to the board meeting. He looked at the legal pad, looked at the laptop screen. The apartment around him was quiet in the way that apartments with sleeping children were quiet. Not empty, but settled. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street below. He pulled the laptop toward him and began drafting a message to Karen Lyle, asking for Patricia Weil's board appointment history and any disclosed professional relationships on file. He sent it at 10:53. At 10:56, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No message. Just an image, a photograph taken from outside a building. The building was this one, his building. The photograph showed his kitchen window, lit from inside, with his silhouette visible at the table. His blood went cold in the specific, trained way. Not panic, not paralysis, but the sharp, clarifying drop in temperature that meant his body had correctly identified a situation and was allocating resources accordingly. He stood and moved to the window and stood to one side of it, not in front of it, and looked down at the street. Empty. Or appearing empty, which was not the same thing, and he knew the difference. He pulled the curtain. He stood in the middle of his kitchen for a moment. Sophie's room was down the hall. He listened. Her door was closed. The apartment was still settled. He looked at the photograph again. Whoever had sent it was communicating something precise. I know where you live. I know you're working against me. I know you have something to lose. It was a threat that didn't announce itself as one, the most effective kind. He saved the image with a timestamp. He wrote the number down on the legal pad. He went and stood in Sophie's doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe. Then he went back to the table and kept working. Nathaniel Cross had spent months building something he believed was unassailable. He'd arranged pieces on a board with patience and precision and the kind of confidence that came from operating without real opposition. He didn't understand yet that what he'd done by sending that photograph was tell Ethan Walker exactly how seriously he was being taken. And in Ethan's experience, the moment an enemy took you seriously was the moment you'd started to win. He didn't sleep much after the photograph. Not because of fear. Fear wasn't quite the right word for what he felt. And he'd spent enough years in situations that warranted actual fear to know the difference. It was more like the specific alertness that came from knowing the game had changed registers. The photograph meant Nathaniel had people outside the company, people willing to cross lines that corporate maneuvering didn't usually cross. That was useful information. It was also information that required him to rearrange some things. At 6 a.m, he called Carol. I need a favor, he said, when she picked up on the third ring with the voice of someone who had been awake for a while and didn't mind. Carol had 3 kids and a schedule that started before sunrise. Sophie? She said immediately. She's fine. I just need to change the pickup and drop-off arrangement for a while. Pick her up from school myself when I can, but on the days I can't, I need someone she knows. Not a new person, not a service. A pause. How long is a while? 2-3 weeks, maybe less. Ethan. Her voice was careful. Is everything okay? Work situation, he said. Nothing that touches Sophie directly. I just want the routine tightened. Okay, Carol said, without the follow-up question she probably wanted to ask. That was the thing about Carol. She understood when to let something be what it was. I can do pickup 3 days. What about the other 2? I'll figure out the other 2, he said. He spent the next 40 minutes making adjustments. He told himself it was precautionary, and he believed that mostly. The photograph had probably been meant to rattle him into backing off. It was the kind of move someone made when they wanted to demonstrate capability without committing to action. The message was, I can reach you rather than I will reach you, and there was an important distinction there. But he had a 9-year-old daughter who took the same route to the same school at the same time every morning, and the distinction between those 2 messages was only important until it wasn't. He drove Sophie to school himself. She was quieter than usual. She'd noticed something in his manner that morning. He could tell, the particular way she stopped filling conversational space when she sensed he was processing something he hadn't finished processing. At the school entrance, she got out and then leaned back in through the open door. You're going to tell me when there's something I actually need to know, right? She said. Not accusatory, just confirming the terms of the arrangement. Yeah, he said. Okay. She straightened up, pulled her backpack strap, walked in. He watched until the door closed behind her and then sat there for another 15 seconds, which he recognized as irrational but did anyway before pulling into traffic. He forwarded the photograph to Karen at 7:45 with a note asking her to route it through IT security for metadata analysis. He wanted to know what device had taken it, what network it had transmitted on, and whether the number it came from had any connection to Ashford Technologies systems or personnel. Karen's response came back in 11 minutes. Already flagged and in queue. Also, you have a 7:30 with legal you weren't told about. Conference room B, 39th floor. Nathaniel called it. He read that twice. Then he typed back, I'll be there. Who else is attending? Gerald Fitch, Patricia Weil, 2 people from outside counsel I don't recognize, and Nathaniel. He sat in the elevator and thought about that configuration. Fitch and Weil were the board members he'd flagged, the 2 most clearly in Nathaniel's corner. Outside counsel meant legal firepower, which meant whatever this meeting was, It had been prepared in advance with documentation ready to deploy. The 7:30 time meant Nathaniel had scheduled it before Ethan arrived, betting he either wouldn't find out until he walked in or would find out just barely too late to prepare. The elevator opened on 39. He walked to conference room B at 7:28. The room was already occupied. Nathaniel was at the head of the table, which was the expected choice, the kind of small territorial claim that communicated authority before a word was spoken. Fitch was to his right, a heavy-set man in his 60s with the practiced blandness of someone who'd spent decades being in rooms where other people took the visible risks. Patricia Weil was across from Fitch, composed, a legal pad in front of her with notes already written that Ethan couldn't read from the door. The two outside counsel were at the far end with a laptop open between them. Nathaniel looked at Ethan when he came in with an expression that was perfectly calibrated. Not surprised to see him, not welcoming, just professionally neutral, with a current running underneath it that said, "Good, you're here. Let's see how this goes." "Mr. Walker," he said, "glad you could make it. We were just getting organized." Ethan sat down across from him, not at the end. He set his phone on the table face down and folded his hands and waited. "As I mentioned to the board members present," Nathaniel began with the ease of someone settling into a prepared text, "this is an informal informational session. Given the events of last week and the somewhat unusual personnel decisions that followed, Gerald and Patricia felt it would be appropriate to get some clarity before the scheduled board meeting." "Clarity on what specifically?" Ethan said. Nathaniel looked at him. "On your qualifications for the role you've been given." "That's an HR matter," Ethan said. "If the board has concerns about a personnel decision, the process for raising them is through the governance committee, with documentation submitted 14 days in advance of a board session. That's in the bylaws." He looked at Fitch and Weil. "Were you both unaware of that process, or is this meeting happening outside that process deliberately?" A small silence. Fitch cleared his throat. "We're not here to create a formal record. This is simply—" "Then we're done," Ethan said pleasantly. "Because without a formal record, this conversation has no governance standing, which means anything discussed here can't be actioned, which means the only reason to have it is to fish for information or create pressure. I'm not interested in either." He looked at Nathaniel. "If you'd like to raise a formal challenge to my position, I'll make sure Ms. Ashford's legal team has everything they need to respond." He stood up. "Sit down, Mr. Walker." Nathaniel's voice had shifted. The professional neutrality hadn't cracked, but it had tightened. "We haven't finished. I came to a meeting I wasn't officially told about," Ethan said, still pleasant. "I've identified it as procedurally irregular. I'm leaving." He picked up his phone. "Have a good morning." He walked out. In the hallway, his hands were completely steady, which he noticed and was glad about. His heart rate was up, not dramatically, but enough to feel, and he understood that the meeting had been a test as much as a play, that Nathaniel had wanted to see how he moved under sudden institutional pressure, and that leaving the way he'd left had been the correct response, but it also cost him something, because now Nathaniel knew he'd prepared. He went to his office and called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. He gave her 60 seconds of information. She was quiet for a moment. "He called that meeting 2 days ago," she said. "Karen just confirmed. He's been planning this sequence." "I know. The outside counsel is the part that matters. That's not cheap. And you don't hire outside counsel for an informal chat. He's building something he plans to introduce at the board meeting, and he's using these smaller moves to test what we know and how fast we respond." Ethan turned to his window. "We're at 13 days. "I know," she said. "I need the communications access," he said. "The server logs. I've been trying to build this from the outside, and it's taking too long." A long pause. Longer than the previous ones. "If I authorize that," Victoria said, "and he finds out—" "He already knows we're building a case," Ethan said. "He sent someone to photograph my apartment 2 nights ago." Silence. "He what?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of something recalibrating. "Unknown number. Image of my kitchen window. My silhouette at the table." He said it flatly, without drama. It was a message. He's not concerned about staying in the lanes anymore. That means he's close to ready, or he thinks we're close to finding something. He paused. We need to be close to finding something. I'm authorizing the access, she said. I'll call IT governance directly. You'll have it by noon. Thank you. Ethan. She stopped, started again. Your daughter. I've handled the arrangements, he said. She's fine. If you need anything, I need the server access and I need 12 days, he said. That's what I need. Patik. He had the access by 11:40. He spent the afternoon with a member of IT governance named Daniel Cho, who was 26 years old, wore the same brand of running shoes in 3 different colors, and was the fastest person Ethan had ever watched navigate a system architecture. Daniel asked no questions about why they were doing what they were doing, which was either professionalism or the studied incuriosity of someone who had learned that knowing less was sometimes better. Either way, Ethan appreciated it. They started with Nathaniel's company email, which was clean in a way that was itself informative. 3 years of executive communications with almost nothing controversial, nothing personal, nothing that looked like it had been written by a human being in a moment of actual feeling. Every email was functional, precise, managed. It was the inbox of someone who had always assumed it would eventually be reviewed. He's not using this for anything real, Ethan said. Daniel glanced at him. Calendar? Calendar. The calendar was more interesting, not because it contained anything incriminating, Nathaniel had been careful there too, but because of the negative space, the blocked times, the recurring entries marked private that had no location or attendee data. Daniel pulled the metadata on those entries and found that 3 of them had been accessed from an IP address that didn't belong to Ashford Technologies' network. That IP, Ethan said. Can you trace it? Daniel typed for a moment. It's a VPN exit node. Commercial service. I can't get behind it from here. He paused. But the access pattern is consistent. Same node, always on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He looked at Ethan. Someone connecting to his calendar on a schedule. Patricia Wiles' external consultation blocks were Tuesdays and Thursdays. Pulled Wiles' calendar too, Ethan said. The overlap was exact. Every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 weeks, in the 45-minute window where Wiles' calendar showed external consultation and Nathaniel's showed private, someone had accessed both calendars from the same external IP. They're syncing, Daniel said. They're coordinating, Ethan said, and doing it outside company channels. He sat back. What about Marcus Reeves, security hire from Sentinel Group? Can you pull his access log for the server room? Daniel pulled it. Marcus Reeves had accessed the executive floor server room 11 times in his first 6 weeks of employment. 8 of those accesses were during off hours. In 4 of those sessions, the log showed data transfer to an external device. What kind of data? Ethan asked. The log doesn't capture content, Daniel said, just that something was transferred. Volume? He squinted at the screen. Consistent with document files. Not huge, but not nothing. Ethan thought about what Victoria had said. Nathaniel has sources in my legal team. He thought about the restructuring plan that Nathaniel had apparently known about before it was finalized. Pull the dates of those transfers, he said. I want to cross-reference them with document activity in the legal department. It took Daniel 20 minutes. Of the 4 transfer dates, 3 of them showed document access in the legal team's shared drive in the hours before Reeves went to the server room. Different legal team members accessing different documents. Nothing that looked coordinated from the inside. But in 3 of the 4 cases, a document that had been accessed that day included material related to Victoria's restructuring plan or board governance procedures. Someone in legal was pulling documents and passing them to Reeves, who was transferring them out. Okay, Ethan said. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he said to Daniel, I need everything you've just shown me in a format that can be presented to people who aren't technical, clean, chronological, annotated. How technical can the annotations be? Assume the audience is intelligent, but hasn't spent time in systems architecture. Daniel nodded, already typing. Give me 2 hours. You've got 90 minutes, Ethan said, and Daniel didn't argue, which told Ethan he'd estimated correctly. He brought everything to Victoria at 4:15. She read through it at her desk while he stood at the window, giving her room to absorb it without his face in her peripheral vision. He heard the quality of her silence change twice while she read. Once when she got to the Reeves section, and again when she got to the cross-reference with the legal department documents. "Someone on my legal team," she said. "Not a question." "The access pattern points to two people who consistently pulled the relevant documents," he said. "One of them is in the building right now. The other is working remotely today. I don't want to move on either of them until we have the full picture. Because if we spook one, Nathaniel knows instantly, and he moves up his timeline." He turned from the window. "The board meeting is in 11 days. If he's planning to introduce medical testimony, documentation, and board votes, that takes preparation time he's already used. Pulling it forward is possible, but it would cost him something. If we can get through 11 days without him knowing how much we have, we control the timeline." Victoria closed the folder. She looked at her desk for a moment, at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone doing math that wasn't about numbers. 3 years, she said. "I worked with this man for 3 years." "I know," Ethan said. "I defended him to people who had concerns. Early on, there were 2 executives who—" She stopped. "I told them they were reading ambition as threat, that ambition wasn't disqualifying. They might have been right about the read and wrong about the conclusion," he said. "Ambition isn't disqualifying. What he did with it is a different thing." She looked up at him. "You're being charitable to me." "I'm being accurate," he said. "There's a difference between missing something and creating it. You didn't create this." She was quiet for a moment, then, "What do we do now?" "We keep moving like we don't know what we know," he said. "I attend the meetings I'm supposed to attend. You run the company. We don't change anything visible." He paused. "And I need to have a conversation with your outside legal counsel, the real one, your team, about what we're building and how to make sure it's airtight before the board meeting. I'll set that up for tomorrow morning." "Early," he said, "before the building fills up." She nodded. Then she said, "The photograph of your apartment. I'm handling it." "I don't want you to just handle it," she said. And there was something in her voice that was different from the CEO register, more direct, less managed. "I want you to tell me if it escalates. I'm not going to be the person who doesn't know what's happening to the people around her. Not again." He looked at her for a moment. There was something genuine in what she'd said, something that had cost her something to say. And he recognized it as the kind of statement that people made when they'd spent a long time operating from behind a wall and had recently taken damage to it. "I'll tell you," he said. "Thank you." He left her office and went back to his and sat down and thought about 11 days. The board meeting was in a formal conference suite on the 44th floor, the top of Ashford Technologies' space, a room used for the occasions that needed to feel important, with a long table, high-backed chairs, and a view that on clear days reached to the harbor. It was not a clear day. It was overcast and cold, and the windows gave them a view of low gray cloud and the tops of buildings disappearing into it, which felt appropriate in a way Ethan didn't take the time to analyze. He'd spent 11 days building toward this room. He had slept badly for most of them, eaten inconsistently, and had 3 conversations with Sophie at the kitchen table between 9 and 10 at night that he would remember for a long time, about fairness, about what to do when someone more powerful than you is doing something wrong, about whether winning was the same as being right. She'd initiated all 3. She'd also, in the way that she had, somehow understood that what he needed from those conversations was not advice but company, and she'd given him that without being asked and without calling attention to the fact that she was doing it. He stood at the back of the room as the board members filed in. 14 people total. The full board, which meant Nathaniel had called for a full session, which was his right as COO when governance procedures were the subject. Victoria came in last with her outside legal counsel, a woman named Ruth Kaplan, who was 62 years old, had argued before federal courts, and had spent the 40-minute prep session that morning asking questions so precise that Ethan had found himself recalibrating his assessment of what sharp actually meant. Nathaniel was already seated. He had a presentation queued. He had folders distributed to each board member before they sat down, which was a procedural irregularity that Ruth had already noted and would address. Gerald Fitch called the session to order. That was the first indicator. Fitch was chairing, not the independent board chair, which meant the parliamentary structure of this meeting had already been manipulated. Ruth Kaplan raised her hand before Fitch finished his opening sentence. "Point of order," she said. "The chair of this session has not been selected by standard procedure. Under the governance bylaws, Section 9, subsection C, the independent chair presides unless incapacitated or absent. Neither condition applies today." Fitch looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, "Gerald agreed to chair as a matter of convenience." "Convenience isn't a governance category," Ruth said pleasantly. "I'd like the independent chair to take the seat, or I'd like the reason for this deviation entered formally into the record before we proceed." A minute of friction. The independent chair, a woman named Sylvia Hartman, who had the expression of someone who had not been warned about this and found it irritating, moved to the head of the table. Fitch moved to his regular seat. Nathaniel's expression remained professionally neutral, but something around his eyes had tightened. Round one, Ethan thought. Nathaniel presented for 22 minutes. It was, Ethan had to acknowledge, an impressive piece of work. The medical angle was handled through a consultant's report. A psychiatrist named Dr. Howard Price, who had apparently evaluated Victoria through a review of behavioral records, reports from unnamed colleagues, and a 40-minute interview conducted the previous month under the framing of a routine executive wellness assessment. The report concluded that Victoria showed signs of decision-making impairment and elevated cognitive risk factors consistent with the pressures of executive leadership at scale. Ethan had read a version of this report 4 days ago, obtained through channels he'd spent 2 days carefully constructing without Nathaniel knowing. He'd then spent an afternoon on the phone with 3 different psychiatrists, including a former colleague from his military medical training, reviewing Price's methodology. When Nathaniel finished, Ruth Kaplan requested the floor. She spent 5 minutes on Dr. Price's methodology. She did it methodically, without heat, the way you dismantled something when you wanted the pieces identifiable rather than destroyed. Price had not conducted an in-person clinical assessment. His behavioral records came from a source that could not be named under the report's own disclosure section. The unnamed colleagues who had contributed observations had not signed disclosure waivers, making their contributions hearsay inadmissible under the governance procedures for fitness challenges. The interview, which Price described as a structured clinical conversation, had been conducted without Victoria being informed of its intended purpose. In summary, Ruth said, this report does not meet the evidentiary standard for a fitness challenge under this board's own governance documents. I have those standards here if anyone wants to review them. She produced a folder. She had the appropriate number of copies. The report is, however, useful as a demonstration of the preparation that has gone into this session, which brings me to the second matter. Ethan moved to the front of the room. He didn't have a presentation. He had Daniel Cho's annotated documentation, copied and distributed now by Karen, who had come in and moved through the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time to do this particular thing. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He didn't have Ruth Kaplan's precision or her command of procedural language. What he had was the specific quality of attention that came from someone who had spent years in situations where clarity was a survival requirement, not a stylistic preference, and who communicated the way that kind of person communicated. Without performance, without ornament, just the sequence of facts in the order they were most clearly understood. He walked the board through the server logs, the external IP, the Tuesdays and Thursdays, the calendar coordination between Nathaniel and Patricia Weil through a VPN masked connection that kept it off company systems, Marcus Reeves and the data transfers, the legal team document pulls, and the timing correlation. He walked them through the security protocol modifications, the credential misuse, 3 instances, not 1, with timestamps in comparison to Victoria's verified location at the time of each modification. The October 9th dinner in Connecticut, documented. He walked them through the hiring records for the 3 security personnel Nathaniel had brought in during the past 8 months, and the specific access authorities each of them had been granted, and the standard procedures that those grants had bypassed. He did not editorialize. He presented sequence and let the sequence speak. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel spoke twice during the presentation. The first time was to question the legality of the server access, which Ruth addressed in 2 sentences by referencing the authorization Victoria had provided to IT governance and the board's own cyber audit authority. The second time was to characterize the IP correlation as circumstantial, which was technically accurate and completely beside the point, and Ethan thought most of the room understood that. Patricia Weil did not speak at all. She had been watching the table in front of her for the last 12 minutes with the expression of someone doing internal calculations about their own position. Sylvia Hartman called a 10-minute recess at the 1-hour mark. Ethan stepped out into the hallway. Victoria came out a minute later. They stood near the window at the end of the hall and didn't say anything for a moment, listening to the building's ventilation system and the muffled sound of conversation from behind the conference room door. "Well, it's gonna flip," Victoria said quietly. "I think so too." "How many does that give us?" "Assuming Fitch holds and the 2 others I'm not sure about, stay with Nathaniel. You're at 9 to 5, maybe 10 to 4. He looked at the cloud cover through the window. "Enough." "It has to be more than enough," she said. "Enough doesn't hold." 11 to 3, he said. "If Hartman reads the room, which I think she will." Victoria was quiet for a second. The legal team member who was pulling the documents. "We know which one," he said. "She's not in the building today. HR has been notified and is holding." "And Reeves?" "Building security flagged his badge this morning. He hasn't been told why yet." She nodded. She was doing the thing he'd noticed she did when she was holding more than she was showing, the slight evenness of breath, the deliberate stillness of her hands. "You should know," she said, "that when I hired you, I wasn't entirely sure this was going to work. I believed in the instinct, but I didn't have certainty." "That's honest," he said. "I'm trying to be." She looked at him. "I also want to be honest that what you did in there, the way you presented it, I couldn't have done that. Ruth couldn't have done it the same way. There was something about the way you laid it out that—" She stopped, searching. It didn't feel like an attack. It felt like turning a light on. He thought about that. "Attacks give people something to defend against," he said. "Facts just sit there." She looked at him for a moment. Then the conference room door opened and Karen appeared in the gap and said, "They're ready now." The vote happened at 2:17 in the afternoon, 12 to 3. Nathaniel Cross sat through the reading of the result with the specific stillness of a man who had committed to a posture and was not going to abandon it regardless of what it cost him to maintain it. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the conference room without speaking to anyone. Ethan watched him go. Ruth Kaplan was already on her phone, coordinating with the company's general counsel. Fitch had the expression of a man rapidly reassessing a series of decisions he'd made over the past several months. Patricia Weil had provided a written statement to the record 20 minutes before the vote, which Ruth was reviewing. Sylvia Hartman called the room back to order to address 3 procedural resolutions, standard governance cleanup after a session like this one, and her voice had the authority of someone who had fully settled into the chair and intended to remain there. Victoria was at the far end of the table, speaking quietly with 2 board members who had voted with her. Her posture was still careful, still managed, still carrying the weight of the last hour in its alignment. But something had shifted slightly in her face. Something had been put down, not picked up, and the absence of it changed the way she held herself in a way that was hard to name precisely. Karen appeared at Ethan's elbow. "There are 2 people in the lobby," she said quietly. "Investigators from the state attorney's office. They've been waiting since noon." A pause. "Ruth made some calls last week." "Good," Ethan said. He looked at the room one more time, the board members gathering their folders, Hartman closing out the formal record, Ruth on her phone in the corner, and then he looked at the window, at the low gray cloud, at the city underneath it doing what the city always did, which was continue without particular regard for what was happening in any specific room. He took out his phone and texted Carol. "I'll do pickup today. Back to normal schedule, thank you." Then he texted Sophie. "Coming to get you myself. Should be there right at 3. Her response came back in 40 seconds. "Okay, did it work?" He looked at the message for a moment. "Yeah," he typed. "It worked." 3 dots appeared, then, "Good. I'm hungry. Can we get tacos?" He put his phone away. He walked out into the hallway and then to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and stood in the small moving box as the numbers descended and felt the specific quality of the ending of a sustained effort. Not triumph, nothing as clean as that, but a kind of completion, the sense of a weight that had been present for 11 days redistributing itself into something that could be set down. The elevator opened. He walked through the lobby and out into the cold air of the afternoon, and the city received him the way it received everyone, without ceremony, without particular acknowledgement, just the ongoing press and motion of 10 million other lives, all happening simultaneously and adjacent. He turned toward the parking garage and walked. Behind him, in a building on 6th Avenue, a man who had spent months building something he thought was unassailable was sitting across from two investigators and beginning to understand the difference between power that was borrowed and power that was earned. Ethan didn't look back. He had a 9-year-old to pick up, and she'd asked for tacos, and that was where his attention went. Forward, to the next thing, to the only thing that had ever been the actual point. Part 5. The tacos were from a place on Junction Boulevard in Queens that had no signage worth mentioning and 3 plastic tables inside and a line out the door on weekends. Ethan had been going there since before Sophie was born, back when he was still in the service and came home on leave and needed something that tasted like the real version of itself rather than the managed version. The woman who ran it, whose name was Dolores and who was in her 70s and had strong opinions about everything, had watched Sophie grow up in increments. The baby he'd carried in once, the toddler who'd pointed at everything, the quiet observant child who had graduated to ordering for herself and tipping correctly. Sophie got 3 carnitas tacos and ate them with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that some things didn't need commentary. Ethan got 2 and a horchata and sat across from her at the plastic table nearest the window and let the afternoon decompress around them slowly. "So," Sophie said, between the second and third taco, "what happens to the bad guy?" "Investigators," he said. "State level. Probably federal eventually, depending on what they find in the financial records." "He goes to jail?" "That's for other people to decide. I found what there was to find and put it in front of the right people. The rest isn't mine." Sophie considered this. "Does that bother you, not knowing how it ends for him?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things when Sophie asked directly. "A little," he said, "but not the way it used to. I used to need to see the whole thing through, completion, all the way to the end." He picked up his horchata. "I think I've gotten better at understanding where my part stops." "That's growth," Sophie said seriously. He looked at her. "Thank you for that assessment." "You're welcome." She finished her third taco and wiped her hands on a paper napkin. "What about your job? Do you still have it?" "Yeah." "Do you want to keep it?" It was a reasonable question, and he hadn't fully answered it for himself yet. He looked out the window at Junction Boulevard, at the late afternoon traffic, and the bodega across the street with the hand-lettered sign in the window, and the 2 men sitting on a stoop 3 doors down, having a conversation that required a lot of hand movement. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me in a month." Sophie nodded, satisfied with the honesty of that. She picked up her own drink. "Carol said you changed the pickup arrangements for a while, because of the job." "Yeah." "Was it because of the photograph?" He looked at her sharply. "I saw it on your phone," she said, without apology. "The screen was unlocked and it was on the table. I didn't mean to see it, but I did." She held his gaze steadily. "You should have told me." "You're 9. "I'm 9 and I live with you," she said. "If something is dangerous enough to change my schedule, I should know why. You said you'd tell me the truth about things." The reproach was quiet and clean and completely fair. He sat with it for a second. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you." She nodded once, accepting it, not making more of it than it was. He thought, not for the first time, that she had an emotional intelligence that he couldn't entirely account for. It hadn't come from him, or not only from him, and he'd long since stopped trying to explain it and just tried to be worthy of it instead. "It's handled now?" she asked. "It's handled." "Okay." She went back to her drink. "Then we're good." The weeks after the board meeting moved differently than the weeks before it. The investigation into Nathaniel Cross expanded in the way investigations did when they found something real, outward and backward simultaneously, touching things that had seemed unrelated and revealing the connective tissue underneath. The forensic accounting team that the state attorney's office brought in found evidence of financial manipulation that went back further than anyone had anticipated. Diverted vendor contracts, a pattern of budget approvals that had quietly redirected funds through a consulting firm that, when examined, turned out to have Nathaniel as a silent partial owner. Not a huge amount by the standards of a company Ashford's size, but enough. Enough to be clear and documentable and deliberately concealed. Marcus Reeves cooperated with investigators within 48 hours of being detained, which was faster than Ethan had expected, and suggested that Reeves had understood from the beginning that his position in this arrangement was expendable and had always planned to cut his losses when the time came. The information Reeves provided filled in several gaps and created several new ones, which was typically how that went. The legal team member, a young woman named Brianna Cho, no relation to Daniel, was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She had passed documents to Reeves on 4 occasions, and the investigator's working theory was that she hadn't fully understood what she was participating in, that she'd believed she was involved in something mundane and had only gradually registered the actual shape of it. Ethan didn't know whether that was true. He thought it was probably partly true, which was how most people ended up in positions they hadn't meant to occupy. Patricia Weil resigned from the board. She issued a statement through her attorney that was notable mainly for what it didn't say. Gerald Fitch retained his seat, but with a visibility that had been substantially reduced. He was present at the subsequent board meeting, but spoke exactly once, on a procedural matter, and with the careful restraint of a man counting remaining goodwill. Nathaniel Cross was formally charged 7 weeks after the board meeting. Ethan read about it in the morning news on his phone, standing in the kitchen in the early gray light, and felt the thing he usually felt when the formal end of something arrived. Not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet settling. The way a room felt after furniture that had been in the wrong place got moved. He made coffee. Sophie came out in her pajamas with her hair in its overnight state, which was elaborate and not in a planned way. "It's on the news," she said, sitting down at the table with her tablet. "Yeah." "You're not in it." "Good." She looked up from the screen. "Doesn't that bother you? You did a lot of the work and your name isn't anywhere." "No," he said, and meant it simply. She studied him for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether an answer was the complete truth or just a partial one. "Okay," she said, returning to the screen. "It doesn't bother me either then. I just wanted to check." Victoria called him into her office on a Thursday afternoon in December, about 6 weeks after the board meeting. Outside the building's windows, the first real cold front of the season had arrived and was making itself known. The sky was the specific blue of deep winter, sharp and without warmth. And the people on the street 40 floors below were moving with the particular purposefulness of people who had somewhere warmer to be. She was at her desk when he came in, not in the chair behind it, but in one of the 2 seats on the other side, which was where she sat when she wanted the conversation to be something other than a meeting. He'd noticed this about her over the past weeks. She was deliberate about the physical geometry of conversations in a way that communicated something real, that the choice of where she sat wasn't incidental, but a statement about what kind of exchange she was looking for. He sat down across from her. "I want to talk about your role going forward," she said. "Okay?" "The immediate crisis is over. The investigation is in other hands. The board is manageable for the first time in a year. The protocols have been rebuilt from scratch. The security team has been restructured, and I have 17 new procedural safeguards that Ruth Kaplan designed and that I would never have thought to ask for 6 months ago." She paused. "I also have a head of executive protection and medical response operations who is, by any reasonable assessment, overqualified for what the day-to-day version of that role looks like now that the emergency has passed." He didn't say anything, waiting for the shape of what she was actually proposing. "I want to restructure the role," she said. "Same title, different scope. I want you building the security and emergency response function from the ground up. Hiring, training, protocol design, cross-department integration. Not just my protection specifically, the whole company. She held his gaze. And I want you involved in the operational review process. The thing Nathaniel exploited was the gap between what the organizational structure said was happening and what was actually happening. You found it. I want you to be the person whose job it is to keep finding it. He sat with that for a moment. That's a significant expansion, he said. Yes. It's also a different kind of job than what I agreed to. Yes, she said again, which is why I'm asking rather than announcing. A small pause. The compensation would reflect the scope. I'm not leading with the compensation. I know you're not. She looked at him steadily. That's one of the reasons I'm asking. He turned to the window briefly. The winter sky was doing what December skies did, asserting itself, making the city below look smaller against its reach. He thought about the shop in Queens, about the Civic with the transmission problem, and Jimmy's voice from underneath it saying, "Job's still here if it doesn't work out." He thought about the stack of bills that was no longer on his counter, the medical debt that had been settled 3 weeks ago with the first full paycheck, the specific lightness of a life that was no longer organized entirely around how close to the edge you were. He thought about Sophie saying, "Don't let them make you into something you're not." "I need a condition," he said. Victoria waited. Sophie's school schedule is non-negotiable. I leave by 4:30 when she has after-school activities, and I'm not available by phone from 7 to 9 most evenings. That's homework time, and it's also the time I'm actually her parent and not something else. He said it without apology and without aggression. I'll work around that. I'll work hard around that. But it doesn't move. Victoria looked at him for a moment. That's your condition, she said. That's my condition. Ethan. Something in her voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more direct. The way things got when the professional register stepped back enough to let the actual person through. That's not a condition. That's just being a parent. She shook her head slightly. I wasn't going to ask you to give that up. He looked at her. Some employers would. I know, she said quietly. I've been that employer. She said it without looking away, which he respected. I'm trying to be something different. You're doing okay at it, he said. She laughed. Not a polished laugh, not a performed one. A real one, short, and slightly surprised, like it had gotten out before she could manage it. It changed her face completely. He thought it was probably the most honest thing he'd seen from her in the 2 months he'd known her, which was saying something, because she'd been honest with him in ways that had clearly been difficult. Okay, she said, pulling herself back. So you'll take it. I'll take it, he said. He didn't tell Sophie about the new role for 2 days, not for any particular strategic reason, but because he needed to sit with it himself first, to let it become real in the way that new things needed time to settle before they could be spoken about accurately. He told her on a Saturday morning over breakfast. She listened without interrupting, which was her practice when she understood something was important. She went very still and let the information arrive in full before she responded. When he finished, she said, So it's a permanent thing now. Looks like it. Are you good at it? Getting there, he said. Better than I expected. She turned her cereal spoon in her bowl for a moment. Can I ask you something? Always. When you were in the Navy, she said carefully, you protected people because you were ordered to. And now you do it because... She paused, working out the distinction. Why do you do it now? It was the kind of question that 9-year-olds sometimes asked that 40-year-olds hadn't managed to answer for themselves. He sat with it genuinely. In the Navy, he said, protecting people was the mission. The mission was the reason. He paused. Now I think the reason is just that some people need protecting and I know how to do it. That's it. There's no chain of command telling me it matters. I just think it does. Sophie absorbed this. That's better, she said. The second one. That's better than the first. Yeah, he said. I think so too. She went back to her cereal. Then, after a moment, Can I meet her? Victoria? He looked up. Why? I want to see what she's like, Sophie said simply. She's important to your life now. I want to see if she's a good person. He thought about Victoria laughing the real laugh. About the way she'd looked at him and said, "I've been that employer without looking away." About a woman who had run a $1 billion company and surrounded herself with the wrong people and had survived the consequences of that and was, as far as he could tell, actually trying to learn from it, which was harder than it sounded and rarer than it should be. "She is," he said, "but you can meet her and decide for yourself." "Good," Sophie said. "That's how it should work." The meeting happened on a Friday afternoon in January in the small conference room on 39 that had the better light. Victoria had cleared an hour, which Ethan suspected was more than the situation strictly required, but which said something about how seriously she was taking the request. She'd also, he noticed when he arrived with Sophie, put a plate of cookies on the table that had not been there when he'd passed the room an hour earlier, which was the kind of small effort that you either found touching or slightly try-hard, and he found it both simultaneously. Sophie shook Victoria's hand with the seriousness of someone conducting an important evaluation. "Sophie Walker," she said. "Victoria Ashford," Victoria said, matching the seriousness without mockery, which was the only correct response. "Your father has told me about you." "What did he say?" Sophie asked. "That you give honest assessments of food, that you're good at strategy, and that you were the one who pointed out he should look up who I was before we met." Sophie glanced at Ethan with an expression that combined pleased and vindicated. "That's accurate," she said, and sat down. He sat to one side and let them talk, mostly. What he noticed was that Victoria talked to Sophie like she was a person, which was not a universal skill among adults, and which Sophie identified and responded to immediately. They talked about school, Sophie's theory on fractions, her friend Maya's hamster senator, the winter concert coming up that she was in through no desire of her own because her teacher had decided she had a good singing voice, and Sophie found this both flattering and inconvenient. They talked about what it was like to run a company, which Victoria answered by saying it was mostly a lot of meetings where you tried to figure out which information was accurate, which made Sophie say that sounds like school, and Victoria say that's not wrong. At one point, Sophie asked directly and without preamble, "Were you scared when you were choking?" A brief pause. Victoria looked at Sophie with the full attention she gave things when she wasn't managing them. "Yes," she said. "Very. But you didn't panic." "I didn't have time to panic," Victoria said. "And then your dad was there, so—" Sophie looked at Ethan with an expression that he could only describe as yes, that tracks, and then looked back at Victoria. "He's like that," she said. "He moves before he thinks about it. It used to worry me when I was little because I didn't understand it, but it's just how he is." "It's a good way to be," Victoria said. "Most of the time," Sophie said, with the specifically provisional tone of a child who had thought about both sides. "Sometimes you should think first." "That's also true," Victoria agreed. He sat there and listened to the two of them negotiate this with each other, and felt something that he didn't have a clean name for, some convergence of things he'd been carrying separately that had just, in this particular room, in this particular January light, found a way to exist in the same space without requiring him to choose between them. The life he'd built around Sophie and the life he was apparently building now. The person he'd been and the person he was becoming, which were not as different as he'd feared they might be. It wasn't neat. That was the thing. It wasn't resolved into anything clean or permanent. Sophie still needed to be picked up and fed and helped through homework on fractions. The investigation into Nathaniel was ongoing and would surface complications for months. The company had 17 new protocols and a restructured security team, and there would be things that didn't work and things that needed to be rebuilt, and moments where Ethan would be in over his head in ways he hadn't anticipated. Victoria was still learning what it looked like to lead differently than she had before, and that was slow work, the kind that didn't show in any single conversation but accumulated over time in small adjustments that gradually became something you could point to. None of it was fixed. That was the honest account of where they all were. But it was real, and it was moving, and it was theirs. On a Tuesday evening in February, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the bills. Not the old stack. That was gone, had been gone since November, and the absence of it still occasionally surprised him the way the absence of a pain surprised you after it had been present long enough to become background. This was the current set. Regular, manageable, the bills of a life being lived within its means rather than against them. He paid them methodically, the way he did everything. In order, completely, without drama. Wrote the checks. stamped the envelopes, set them by the door. Sophie was at the table too, doing homework she hadn't complained about tonight, which was unusual and probably meant it was something she found interesting. She was working on a writing assignment. He'd caught a glimpse of the prompt when he'd passed behind her. Write about a person you admire and explain why. He didn't look at what she was writing. That wasn't his to read unless she offered it. He made tea and brought her a glass of milk without being asked. She drank milk at night, had since she was small, and this was one of those parental routines that had survived her growing out of most of the other ones. She accepted it without looking up. "Dad?" she said, still writing. "Yeah. Do you think things happen for a reason, or do you think they just happen?" He considered that. It was the kind of question that could be answered quickly and wrongly, or slowly and honestly. He chose slowly. "I think things just happen," he said, "and then we decide what they mean, which is different from them having a reason, but it's not smaller." He thought about the restaurant, the sound of the cough going wrong, the 12 feet of marble floor. A thing can matter enormously without it having been arranged to matter. Sophie wrote something. He didn't know if it was related to what he'd said. "I think that too," she said. "I just wanted to check." She kept writing. He drank his tea. Outside, February did what it did, cold and uncompromising and occasionally beautiful in the way that only winter was beautiful, which was without softness, without apology, just the clean, hard fact of the world at its most stripped down. He thought about the man he'd been before that dinner. Not a worse man. He didn't believe that, wouldn't accept the narrative that his life before had been diminished in some way that required rescue. He'd been doing what needed doing, the way he always had. He'd been paying the bills and raising Sophie and working with his hands and carrying the weight of things in the quiet way that he'd learned was his mode of carrying. Not dramatized, not shared beyond what was necessary, just held and managed and moved through. What had changed wasn't him exactly. It was the scale of what he was doing with what he was, the reach of it, the sense that the skills he'd spent 20 years developing, the ones he'd believed had been left behind in a different version of his life when he'd come home to Queens and become a mechanic and a father, those skills had not actually been left behind. They'd just been waiting for the correct application. He didn't think he'd been wrong to step away from that world when Sophie needed him to. He thought that had been exactly the right decision, made for exactly the right reasons, and he would make it again in every version of the choice. But he also thought there was something true in what he hadn't let himself believe for a long time, that the person who moved toward danger when others moved away, the person who recognized an emergency by sound and responded without consultation, the person who found things hidden inside complicated systems by simply staying with them long enough to understand what they were hiding. That person hadn't disappeared when he'd turned in his credentials. That person had just been raising a kid, and now he was doing both. And it was imperfect and expensive and sometimes frightening and occasionally involved tacos on a Tuesday and sometimes involved being photographed through his own kitchen window by someone who meant it as a threat. And none of that was going to resolve into something clean and final because nothing did. Sophie put her pen down. She looked at what she'd written for a moment, head tilted, the expression of someone deciding if it was done. "Okay," she said. "Done." "Good assignment?" "It was fine," she said. "I wrote about you." He looked at her. "Is that okay?" she asked, with the first trace of uncertainty she'd shown all evening. "Yeah," he said. "That's okay." She picked up her milk. "I said that you were the kind of person who moved toward things instead of away from them, and that most people thought that was about courage, but I thought it was actually about paying attention, because you can't move toward something if you don't see it first." She drank, set the glass down. "And that the most important thing I learned from you was that the right thing to do usually isn't complicated. You just have to be willing to do it." He sat across from her at the kitchen table in their apartment in Queens, with the paid bills by the door and the February cold outside the window, and the specific quiet of a Tuesday night that was just a Tuesday night. Not remarkable, not significant, just the ordinary texture of a life being lived. "That's good, Soph," he said. "I know," she said, picking up her pen again to sign her name. "I'm going to get an A." He smiled at his daughter, the real smile, not the managed one, the one he mostly saved for her, and finished his tea. Some people spent their whole lives trying to be seen, trying to be recognized, credited, noticed, rewarded. trying to make sure the world registered that they had been present and had done something worth accounting for. Ethan Walker had never been that. He didn't know how to be that and didn't want to learn. He had moved toward a woman choking in a restaurant because movement was what the moment required, and he was the one who saw it. He had walked into a corporate conflict because someone needed protecting, and he knew how to protect. He had stayed up late in his kitchen working through documents and logs and timeline discrepancies because the truth was in there somewhere, and the truth mattered, not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would credit him for it, but because it was the work, and the work was real. That was the whole of it. That was the thing, if there was a thing. You paid attention. You moved when moving was what was needed. You kept the promises you made, starting with the ones you made to your kid. You did the work without making it about yourself. And somewhere in the doing of all of that, quietly and without announcement, a life became something worth the living of it. Sophie signed her name on the assignment and closed her notebook and stood up and said she was going to brush her teeth. And Ethan said, "Okay," and she padded off down the hallway, and the apartment was briefly louder with the sound of water running and quieter again when it stopped. He sat there for another moment alone. Then he got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check that the door was locked. Because that was what you did, every night, regardless of what else the night had contained, before going down the hall to his own room. The bills were by the door. The city was outside the window. His daughter was asleep. He had work in the morning. It was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't always been able to see it clearly. But then, that was the other thing. The thing Sophie had written without knowing it was the thing. You couldn't move towards something if you didn't see it first. He saw it now. He turned off the light.